一下周老师，就是关于列宁的提出的两个转变学。
富生，
钟杰，
哎，
这么多年没见了啊，就是
那个是2006年吧，还是不是？
是不是？就是上次，就是我们弄那本书完了，后来你又到我那儿去过一次，我也记不起那年了。
对，哎呀，
还好，现在在，
我现在在香港，
在香港啊。
我在香港，对对对。
嗯，
你还是住原来地方吗？
还在那儿，对，
对，
还住
漂亮
那
那个地方，很漂亮，对对。
还在那地方。完了，
你的钢琴弹得很好了吧？现在？
每天都弹，但是这就是自娱了。
对，那当然，这个就是自娱，对
对，对你那个现在就是两边跑哈，就是说
对，我今年我还是在这，今年对。
哦，那你们就是你美国这边的学校还真不错，让你就是那么多时间在另外一个地方啊。
也无所谓了，我不在，我也没花什么钱。
哦，OK。
不像大陆的话呢，你请假的话还有工资。美国就这个，对。
Hey, Massimiliano. Wu Fusheng, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm Andy Shonobaum. You taught me Chinese at Brown University 25 years ago.
Really? Really? Oh,
你是桃李满天下，桃李满天下，对。
So I was graduate student at Brown. So you were one of the students in the Chinese classes, yeah?
Yeah, fourth year Chinese. And actually, I asked you, I was contemplating going to graduate school. And you said, oh, you should go to Columbia and work with David Wang. So I did. So thank you very much. Sage advice.
Very, very nice to meet you after so many years. Yeah.
It's great to see you. You're looking young. You don't look a day over 30.
Yeah, it's kind of shame we didn't get to meet in person for this conference. I was really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me
must
too. But hopefully it'll happen.
Well,
hopefully
the pandemic threw everything off track. So hopefully next year, good enough to resume international travel.
That would be great.
Then I will really urge my partner to convene a conference, maybe several symposium together, just a nice gathering.
So
I'll be there.
Yeah, I'll be there for sure. For the same thing, Zongqi, basically we'll read the same papers.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's fine.
The revised papers.
Revised, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so Andrew, you are now in University of Maryland, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yes, and I'm newly chair of the department, which I am not enjoying at all. I've learned so much in the last few months, and I wish I didn't know any of it.
I know. Yeah. Administration.
Fusheng was a chair sometime, right? Was it?
No, I was not. Yeah. No.
It's
I have been the director of the Confucius Institute, which is going to close next year, you know.
Oh, really? Really interesting.
Yeah, it's the current political situation in the US, you know.
I know. Yeah, Maryland
Is it by order of the government or just the university that decided to?
Yeah, it's not all. I mean, the state legislature passed a resolution demanding the university to close it.
Okay, well.
Then, yeah, I think just 2 days ago, the university president got another letter from the undersecretary of Department of Defense, basically threatening that if the university does not close it, they're going to cut funding to all programs related to any grants, yeah, given by the Defense Department. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, we had a similar thing at Maryland, but our Confucius Institute is, we just moved it off campus. So it's, that solved a lot of the problems. Is they're really active in the local high schools and stuff, but that we don't let them teach classes on campus. And that seemed to make everybody happy, or at least less miserable.
Ours is kind of, we have, 2 teachers who teach on the campus, but also we have a very kind of really active program, outreach program to public high schools. And but they don't care, you know, I mean, I think the university is fine, you know, we'll get by, but really outreach effort really will be completely gone and many kids will be affected.
Yeah, I think that's those are important programs, and they're important for the universities too, because they, you know, get local kids learning Chinese, and then they want to come to the university and continue.
It's kind of very strange, really. It makes me feel that I go through cultural evolution all over again, but in another country.
Oh no! God. Oh God, that is a painful truth. Oh, no. Well, I'll stop talking and let everybody get going. It's great seeing you, Fusheng.
Yeah, same here. Yeah. So do we go by the order of the flyer, Zongqi? Do you know?
I think so. Yeah. Well, wait for Leo. Leo is presiding over the whole procedure, so he tends to show up at the last minute, maybe last 5 minutes. But now it's already time. Right?
Yeah, I mean, if we go over by that order, I'm the first, but I will wait for him. Yeah.
So Chris, well, the moderator, the technician, Chris.
Yeah.
So, well. Wait. We are waiting for you. Hi. Okay, sure. 那你为什么可以跟我打呢？ Oh, I see. Okay. Well, then we have to start here because I just got a WeChat phone call from Leo saying that he had trouble getting online. He was calling me with his cell phone. So he asked me to go ahead. Then I will just begin with some welcoming remarks. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to every one of you. And it's such a pleasure to see old friends and meet new friends. We had a very good morning session, and I'm sure this one will be just as good, if not better. So taking this opportunity, let me share with you about the origin of this project. So this is the project is the brainchild of Professor Yuan Xingpei of Peking University, with whom I partner in founding the Journal of Chinese Literature and Culture, and also the Columbia book series, How to Read Chinese Literature. He's a man in the mid-80s, but very energetic, incredibly aspiring. After initiating our collaborative project, he embarked on even a grander one on the transmission, reception, and transformation of Chinese literature and culture throughout the world. Then in 2019, the summer, I spent 2 summers there, and they invited me to attend the planning committee meeting for this project. And Professor Yuan asked me to take charge of the Western world. I mean, the Europe and America. Of course, I would not do anything other than literature or literature related. Then I say I have no expertise on the history of science and other things. And these are the projects that I could probably do, even though I have not really done any significant work in this area. Then I would like to will be happy to play the role of facilitator. So I got in touch with Steve and Leo and got their support, firm support. Then I thought, since we organized the symposium and we spend time and resources, we should get something more tangible and lasting. So this is basically a principle I went by. Either I do not do a conference, and if I do it, I try to get volumes out. So Leo put me in touch with the Brill, and I had a discussion. They were very enthusiastic, and they supported the idea. So it took us just a few months to complete the review process. Then they offer us the contract for the book series. So this is how the book series came into being. So we had a very good symposium, the first one last summer, and we completed all the manuscript, and then submitted is under review, and I hope they will move faster, and then we can complete the probably revisions. It's on track. Then I hope we will get the volumes out of this one and also the one coming in May. And I'm confident we will have a very good coherent volume. We had a fantastic morning session. I'm sure this one will be just as good. So my hope is still that we will be able to meet in person sometime next year. And in fact, after today's session and tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, I will call Professor Yuan and I will tell him again, we would like to get together in Beijing, sometime next year, if international travel becomes possible. So this is so much of what I want to say. Again, I thank you so much for joining the project, and also thank the friends who got up very early on the American side, like Andrew and others. And they last night, about midnight, right? We completed the morning session here in Asia time and the evening session. Now they come and to attend the second session. I really appreciate that. Okay, that's so much. So Leo, now you're online. Then yes. I give the floor to you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just before I proceed, maybe I should make an announcement. You see, in the schedule that I sent to you a few months ago, I mentioned that your first draft had to be ready by 27th of March. And well, basically, I got papers from everybody except one. And the next date that I indicated was June 30th, 2021. And that's the date or the deadline for reviewers' comments to be sent to authors, June 30th. So one date is missing, and that is the date for your submission of a revised version of your paper. And I'd like to note that I would like to have your paper, your revised paper, by 15th May. if you can, yeah, just try as much as you can. I hope the spring term is over or will be over very soon. So you need to work a little bit harder in the next month and a half and come up with a revised version for me. So I can send it out. Well, we need to give the reviewers at least 1 month to do the reviewing. So May the 15th would be the deadline for the revised draft. Okay, I have told this to someone who is not able to come to this meeting today. Someone who says she'll send me a paper afterwards. So I'm making this announcement for all. Okay, so that is the thing I want to mention before I begin. Now we should move on right away to the poetry and drama section. Okay, there are going to be 5 papers, and they will be presented in the order that I have indicated earlier in an email. I guess the timing is more or less okay for everybody. You don't have to like do your presentation in the middle of the night. Now, the first person to do a presentation is Professor Fusheng of the University of Utah. Fusheng is Professor of Chinese and Comparative Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Utah, and I see that he is here with us already. Now, his paper is titled From Classic Scripture to Literature, Translations of the Qingyang from, by James Lake and by Arthur Whaley. Professor Wu?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, it's a great honor to be here, and I wish we could be in person, but as Zongqi just mentioned that we'll have another chance to meet each other, and I'm really looking forward to that. So my talk, I'll just share the abstract, and then we will, yeah, this is the abstract of my paper. So basically, I'll just elaborate a little bit because time is limited. I won't be able to get into everything. So yeah, okay, I'll start. The Shi Jing, or the Book of Poetry, is one of the most translated Confucian classics in the West. Among its English versions, the best known are those by James Lake and Arthur Whaley, 2 most prominent figures of Chinese translation in the West. This essay examines the complex contextual factors that influenced their translations of the Shi Jing. Active in the mid to late 19th century, when the British Empire was expanding all over the world, James Lake was motivated by religious mission to convert the Chinese nation. He envisioned his translation as a facilitating tool for proselytization. Arthur Whaley, on the contrary, experienced a devastating First World War and a subsequent disillusionment with Western culture. His translation was meant to be part of a general search among Western intellectuals of the time for an alternative, whereby to salvage and rejuvenate the declining Western culture. These ideological drives and aspirations, however, are complicated and sometimes even subverted by their translating praxis at textual level. Lake's evangelical passion is often mingled with a reverence for the Shi Jing as a classic or a scripture, which causes him to adhere closely to the Chinese canonic tradition. Whaley's liberal stance is translated into a desire to strip the Shi Jing of its canonical stature and treat it merely as a work of literature. interpreted from a modern Western perspective and rendered in a highly naturalized or domesticated language and format. And recently, contemporary theories of translation in the West have moved beyond the level of mere cross-cultural communication, where focus is usually on linguistic accuracy for fidelity and verbal equivalence. New approaches to translation, especially literary translation, have shifted attention to the larger paratextual factors involved in the translation process. This includes the socio-historical milieus of both the source and the target cultures, which often influence and even determine the translator's motivation and goal in translating a specific text. His criteria of selection, and even to some extent his method of translation. Of particular relevance to the current essay is the notion of translation as an inscription. Since language is not a mere replica of, but constitutive of thought, translation can never be simply to use target language to mirror or communicate what lies in the source text. Each language is loaded or inscribed by factors that are unique to it, such as peculiar ways of describing social customs, personal behavior, and of expressing feelings and thought. All this constitutes a value system unique to the target culture. When these domestic factors are released during the translation process, they inevitably affect the product of translation. As Lawrence Venuti pointed out, the foreign text then is not so much communicated as inscribed with domestic intelligibilities and interests. The inscription begins with a variety the inscription begins with the very choice of a text for translation, always a very selective, densely motivated choice, and continues in the development of discursive strategies to translate it. Always a choice of certain domestic discourses over others. Hence, the domesticating process is totalizing, even if never total, never seamless or final. So domesticating a foreign text implies the attempt and effort to contain, control, and naturalize its foreignness according to the norms of the target or home language and culture. Venuti admits that although this process is totalizing, it nevertheless it can never be total in its effect. I will argue that it is precisely these tensions or the lack thereof that determine the value and the significance of a translation project or product. As we shall see, great translations are often those where these tensions are kept alive and in balance. So now to Leg's translation of the Shi Jing, entitled the Shi Jing, or the Book of Poetry, the fourth volume of his Chinese classics, this series of 5 volumes. And Leg completed this magisterial set of translation while serving his mission in Hong Kong as a nonconformist Scottish congregationalist for the London Missionary Society, which was founded in 1795 with the goal to achieve a Christian regeneration of the entire world. So it is no surprise that his purpose of taking on this monumental task was at first mainly religious. Yeah, and then I go into, there's a lot of really contextual kind of sources and the materials to demonstrate this kind of religious background of Leg's translation. So I'll just omit that part. And just go on to, yeah, his translation, yeah, straight. Well, if we have time, we can discuss that. But yeah, how do all of these domestic and foreign factors affect like Chinese translation? As I have pointed out earlier, a great translation often contains tensions among various factors in the source and the target language and cultures. In the case of Lag, although he was motivated by his fervent Christian mission and cultural superiority, he never let them completely take over his translating praxis. Two other factors made it impossible, even if he desired it. First, by all accounts, Chinese culture is one of the oldest and the most complicated in the world. And the Confucian books that Lek was aiming to introduce to his fellow missionaries and the people are of a highly refined and complex nature. And as classics, they have long been revered by the Chinese people, like the Bible in the West. To make sense of them, Leg was obliged to devote meticulous attention to their difficult language and the rich contextual traditions. This cannot but deepen his sense of awe as he confronted these canonical texts. Second, in addition to being a pious Christian, Leg was also a very conscientious scholar. This made him seek high academic and standard and respectability for his translations. In fact, in the preface to his Shijing translation, he made it clear that his target audience was the scholarly community rather than his fellow missionaries that he had in mind at first. So, quote, the author hopes that the work which he now offers will be deemed by competent scholars as reliable translation of the original poems, unquote. To achieve this goal, Lex said, quote, he has certainly spared no labor on the translation or on the accompanying notes and the prolegomena to make it as perfect as he could attain to. At another occasion, he claimed that a diligent translator, if he desired for his works to have permanent value, must translate for the hundredth man, because 99 out of 100 people do not care for critical notes. This assertion is apparently at odds with his formally expressed desire to serve the missionary community, which certainly would not have fallen into the category of the hundredth man. So with the above contextual account in mind, let us now turn to Lek's translation of the Shijing. Yeah, Lex stated in his prolegomena that, quote, my object in translating the book of poetry as a portion of the Chinese classics does not require that I should attempt any estimate of the poetic value of the pieces which it is composed. And I touch upon the subject only in a slight and cursory manner, unquote. In other words, his goal was to render Shijing as a cultural classic, not as a work of literature. It should be noted that Lek's notion of a classic or canon was colored by his religious piety. So in his treatment of the Shijing and other Confucian classics, acquired the quasi status of a scripture or text with sacred authoritative stature and significance. Indeed, to reproduce the sacred aura of the Shijing as a classic and a scripture, Lag went out of his way to complete a lengthy, exhaustive Gomina of 182 pages. In this very impressive account, he first provided account of the complex history of this anthology, translated the great preface and all small prefaces to individual poems, as well as some passages from the 韩诗外传 and the 郑玄那个诗谱序 to further facilitate his reader. Lag also provided the specimens of ancient Chinese poems. He gave a kind of very brief introduction to Chinese prosody. So in translating the Shi Jing and other Chinese classics, Lag adopted the following advice from Mencius as his guiding principle. 就是如果说诗者不以文害词，不以词害意，以意逆志，是为得之。Yeah, he rendered this as therefore those who explain the odes may not insist on one term so as to do violence to a sentence, nor on a sentence as to do violence to the general scope. They must try with their thoughts to meet that scope, and then we shall apprehend it, unquote. Mencius, as we know, was discussing how to interpret the poems in the Shi Jing. Lag, in adopting it as a maxim for his translation, demonstrated acute understanding of the translation. That translation is essentially the same type of activity as interpretation, where one must take into full consideration various textual, contextual, linguistic, and historical factors in order to reach a balanced understanding of the text, which is the first step toward a sound translation. This is particularly true in translating an ancient classic like the Shi Jing, because its meaning and significance have evolved throughout its long exegetical history, and thus cannot be merely restricted to the textual level. Yeah, and I'll skip the next part really about, because his translation is mostly guided by really the interpretations of the Han and the Song Dynasty scholars. And I don't know how much time I have. I'm halfway through. Leo, am I already halfway through? So, and now I'll just take a look at one of the samples, really.
Fusheng.
Yeah, am I already halfway through on my time? And just
5 minutes more. Can you hear me? Can you?
5 more minutes? Yes. I have 5 more minutes. Okay. Okay, yeah, and that's and then I discussed 2 samples in this paper. One of I cannot hear you, Leo. I think you have a delay. Anyway, so I'll just go on, you know. I'll be very quick. Yeah. So this is the translation that Lag did of this section. And so this here long, and I just read the English here short, is the dark weed to the left, to the right, borne about by the current. The modest, retiring, virtuous young lady, waking and sleeping, he sought her, and so on. And the part I want to discuss is the translation of this Yao Tiao Shu Nu. So it's here, this is his translation. Yeah, the modest, retiring, virtuous young lady. You know. And so. Sorry, I couldn't find that. Okay, yeah, by all accounts, this is a very close, I mean, even literal translation, because the original portrays a series of acts, like it's able to replicate them with equivalent verbs in the target language. He has to, as usual, add implicit syntactical subject and verbal tense. But in this case, it is not the not as fraught because the context is quite clear. The challenging part to translate is 窈窕淑女, the line 3. The rhymed doublet 窈窕, being tantalizingly elusive even in the original Chinese, has no equivalent in English. Leck's rendering of this line uses 4 adjectives punctuated by 3 commas. The modest, retiring, virtuous young lady. Yeah, poetically, this may sound wordy and awkward, but it is based entirely on the Mao interpretation of the line. This is a 悠闲真专之善女. That is the Mao kind of notes, yeah, the more exegetical note on this line. So apparently Leck wanted to convey as much as possible the full scope of meaning and significance in the original, according to a traditional authority, even if this means that he must sacrifice the poetic value, quality of the line. Yeah, since I don't, I mean, for Whaley, really, I mean, I don't have time to go into Whaley's background. Whaley's time obviously is very different. So for Whaley to translate the Shi Jing, it's not really the same as for Leck, whose kind of goal is a religious proselytization. For Whaley, Shi Jing is a work of literature and nothing more, basically, in terms of cultural values. He actually does not think very much about it. And he pretty much regards it as a kind of, as a book anthology of folk songs, really interpreted from the kind of anthropological perspective. And also Whaley's attitude toward Chinese culture is also very different, really. It's not as chauvinistic. And because really he regards Chinese culture rather than as a kind of object to be conquered, but as an object of appreciation. Also, it can provide a certain kind of inspiration, even alternative to the declining Western culture at that time. And then this translation by Whaley. So here, this is the, I just want to compare this line, 窈窕淑女. Whaley's translation is very straightforward. As you can see, she was shy, was this noble lady. You know, so basically, that line, the translation, but it uses shy as a colloquial, kind of very ordinary word, you know. So the choice of this word is not only a kind of verbal choice, but also shows Whaley's kind of attitude toward this so-called classic or canon, because in his mind, it does not carry that kind of traditional authority as it does to Leck. So Leck has to go out of his way to try to translate all the implied meanings of this, especially 窈窕, this expression, really. And Leck's translation was based on the Mao interpretation. But Whaley simply ignores all of that. And his translations in the shy is, again, it's a very simple, colloquial, ordinary word, you know. So that the choice of this word also indicates a kind of cultural and cultural attitude toward this so-called classic. So in his mind, it does not have that kind of aura of a canon or classic anymore. It is simply a piece of literature, and he can translate according to his own kind of perspective and understanding.
Sorry,
so that
Fusheng, probably we need to stay on track, and the time, probably your time won't be up, and try to finish in 2 minutes, because Leo, I think, lost us. Then he was trying to call me, and then the line disconnected. So I assume that he wants me to keep time.
Okay, I'll conclude right now. Basically, so this paper examines these 2 translations of the same piece of work, but the 2 translations are done from very different perspectives. And in translation theory, this is a kind of complicating example, because usually Leck's translation would fall into the category of foreignizing translation, And Whaley's translation would fall into the category of domesticating translation. Normally, a foreignizing translation carries a kind of liberal attitude because the liberal attitude toward the source text, because really the foreignizing translation wants to keep as much as it can the original flavor of the text. And the domesticating translation is just the opposite. But in terms of Whaley and Lag, really you have just the reverse, you know. I mean, Lag, who is very, very conservative, you know, Christian, and his translation adopts a highly foreignizing style, but for Whaley, you know, he's a very kind of liberal-minded intellectual at that time, and his translation basically adopts a highly domesticating kind of characteristic. And in this, as we can tell really from that example, his treatment of that Yao Tiao Shunü is quite liberal, you know, almost to an extent of being kind of a little bit disrespectful, you know, if you regard that as a kind of ancient classic. So, but I mean, my point is that really is precisely this kind of ability for these two translators to transcend this kind of theoretical framework or kind of category, you know, that makes them great, because you cannot simply mechanically apply a certain theoretical framework and use it to frame their translations, and their translations are larger than that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and I do not have the schedule in front of me, and my feeling is that we have about 10 minutes for discussion. Is that right? And now it's 9:35, and how about having 10 minutes discussion? Any questions from the fellow participants? Any questions?
Yeah, there's one. I think it's Professor Wang. Yes.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor Wu, for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed reading your paper. So I have a question about the years of the two different translations. Do you have the specific years of the two translators' translations?
Oh, I think his Chinese class is published in 1870 something. And Whaley, I don't remember exactly. Whaley is,
I think it's 1937. Is that right, Whaley?
That's Whaley in 1930. Yeah, 1930.
And James Lake, 1861.
Right.
Yeah. And then my next question is whether Arthur Whaley's translation based on the Chinese original word, it is a relay translation. In other words, based on Lac's translation and other translations.
No, he doesn't. I mean, I talked about really his his opinion of Lac's translation. He's very dismissive. He thinks Lac's translation is entirely useless for the modern readers because it's too academic. And Whaley's, understanding of of the book of Shijing is greatly influenced by the French scholar called really Granit or Canale, because he wrote a book called really the sounds and the folk culture and the sounds in ancient China. And that is a study of Shijing. And so he refers to that scholar a lot. And there's another French scholar, I don't remember his name of the time, and there's another French translation that he refers to that as well. But he did consult Lac's version.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then my comment, I have a comment because obviously this poem is so famous, and it is actually a very critical piece in Mudantian, the Peony Pavilion. And Cyril Birch actually translated the poem himself. And in terms of that line, Yao Tiao Shunü, he translated as so delicate, the virtuous maiden. So delicate, I think delicate catches Yao Tiao rather than shine. Well, shine, it's okay. It's not really reflecting only the mannerism in terms of, I think, not really at the physical feature of the young lady. I think delicate catches both the physical and also the mannerism. So it's interesting that you probably sometimes you come to a complete different version of the translation other than Lac's translation, and which is a two in a word to word translation, and Arthur Wallis's translation, which is sometimes I feel like a little bit away from the Chinese original.
But that is precisely the point Wiley wants to make. I think really in studying the translation, we should go above really simply interpreting on the verbal level, you know, and Wiley, Lac's translation, for example, modest, retiring, virtuous, young, very complicated, but that's because he wants to convey the original meaning according to classical authority of China, Mao and Zheng Xuan. But for Wiley, all of that is irrelevant because one of the tenets of modernist poetry is to use the language of the day to write poetry. So when you come to Ezra Pound's translation, that is even more obvious. And so it's not simply, and delicate I would say delicate is a very abstract word, you know. So yeah, basically the point is, as you said, really shy seems to be a little bit too, I talked about really over translation, under translation. If Lac's translation of that line is over translation, and then Wiley's is certainly kind of under translation. But again, that is kind of purposeful. That is precisely the point he wants to make.
You know, yeah, probably we need to move on to the next one. And sorry that Leo appear and disappear, and then I'm in an unfortunate position, you know, to cut short what you want to say in order to save time for the next person. We cannot stretch indefinitely into the wee hours. So who is the next speaker? Could the next speaker, according to the printed schedule, could the next speaker?
Should be me. It should be me.
Okay, please. Yeah.
Canale.
Yeah. Massimiliano,
Okay.
yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, everyone. And I want to thank the organizers, Professor Tsai and Professor Chan, and all the other participants. I'm very honored to be here with you today. I don't know if you can see my presentation already.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Okay, thank you. So my talk today will be about the history of translation and reception of the Chinese Ci song lyric in the West. I will try to understand why this genre of Chinese poetry was translated so much later and in such a lesser measure in the West compared to other forms of Chinese poetry, especially the higher forms like Shi poetry. And I will also take into consideration the influence that Christianity, Christian morality could have exerted in shaping this particular delay in the translation of the song lyric in the West. So I would go straight to the beginning for a matter of time. During the 19th century, I didn't find examples of translations of the song lyric in the West, but I found some mentions, very few mentions actually, and their tone is generally one of let's say, diffidence. For example, Alexander Wiley, who was a Protestant missionary and a translator, he wrote that Ci is held in light esteem by native scholars and barely admitted within the legitimate range of literature. And he added that it is generally of a trivial cast and has no counterpart in European literature. So the attitude was usually like this during the 19th century. There was a diffidence toward the song lyric. It was considered immoral, trivial, really a low kind of poetry. So when we want to know why this translation of the song lyric had a delay compared to other forms of Chinese literature, we should first consider that poetry in general was translated later than prose. We know that, for example, the 4 books were translated 140 years before the classic of poetry. And so there is a delay in general in the translation of poetry as compared to prose. And of course, if we look at poetry, there is a delay in the translation of lower genres like the song lyric compared to higher genres like shi poetry. For example, the first published book dedicated to the translation of song lyrics of the Song Dynasty that I found only appeared in 1933. That means 70 years later than the first published book dedicated to a translation of Tang Shi poetry, and 100 years later than the publication of the first translation of the classic of poetry. Why was poetry translated later than prose? Of course, one of the reasons is that it was considered harder to translate. For example, in the 19th century, the French sinologist Rémusat wrote that Chinese poetry is truly untranslatable, and one can perhaps add that it's often unintelligible, end of quote. Of course, there was this situation with poetry. It was considered harder to translate. But then if we look at Ci poetry in particular, there are more obstacles in the way, because the translators in the 19th century were usually Christian missionaries. So we should take into account this fact, the influence that Christian morality could have had in delaying the translation of the song lyric in the West. The final goal of missionaries was proselytism, to convert the Chinese people, and they wanted to do that, especially the Jesuits, by identifying themselves with Confucianists, so understanding deeply Confucian thought. And of course, the song lyric, the Ci song lyric, didn't give any insight into the world of Confucianism, as we know. But there is, this is not the only reason, I think. There is also something more. The discourse of the song lyric is not only not very much compatible with many aspects of Confucianism, but also with Christianity itself, because it always, the subject is often that of extramarital affairs between literati and courtesans. So the subject matter is not one that Christian morality would really appreciate, I believe. So we could try to say that Confucianism in China and Christianity in Europe played to some extent a similar role in some ways. For example, they both advocated order and moral control. They both placed limits to human desire, and they both maintained the priority of society over the individual, of the objective over the subjective. I think that the situation here in Western culture is not always like this. I mean, there are areas of European Western culture which actually are more compatible maybe with the discourse of the Ci song lyric. For example, I'm thinking about Greco-Roman culture or Renaissance culture, which was in some ways a kind of prosecution of some legacy from classical Europe. If we try to put on one side the Chinese song lyric and a form of ancient European literature, and on the other side Confucianism and Christianity, we can see that we could do a parallel. Of course, the cultural differences are huge, the contexts are completely different, but we could try to say that both the Chinese song lyric and, for example, Greek tragedy had something in common, and on the other hand, Confucianism and Christianity also had something in common that could be useful for our discussion. For example, the Chinese song lyric and Greek tragedy alike both share a view about the inevitability of human suffering. It's very important in tragedy, but also in the song lyric. The word "chou," for example, is one of the main, the most used words in song lyrics, actually. And on the other hand, we have Confucianism and Christianity. They both show a fundamental optimism, whether it is towards God in Christianity or towards the order of society in Confucianism. If we go back, Chinese song lyric and Greek tragedy, they both show a tendency to voice doubt, uncertainty about the future, while on the other hand, Confucianism and Christianity, they share ultimate certainties, superior certainties. We have Chinese song lyric and Greek tragedy, which express a conceptual world of chaos, centrifugal tendencies. So there are tensions between subjective desire and objective reality in the discourse of Chinese song lyric and in the discourse of Greek tragedy. But on the other hand, if we look at Confucianism and Christianity, they both seem to put a certain emphasis on harmony, on the importance of centripetal tendencies. For example, subjective desire is usually subordinated to objective reality, to superior reality and structures. Also, Chinese song lyric and Greek tragedy both show a certain inclination to express change, impermanence, while on the other hand, Confucianism and Christianity seem more devoted to a view of stability and permanence. Non-didactic vision of poetry, of course, the Chinese song lyric is not a didactic kind of poetry. Of course, there has been some attempts, especially during the Qing dynasty with the Changzhou school of criticism on the song lyric to say that the song lyric had a didactic view and to connect it to the exegesis of the Shijing. But of course, these are later attempts and usually dismissed as not very credible. And on the other hand, we have a didactic vision of poetry, which is very important both in Confucianism and Christianity in their own peculiar ways. Also, finally, private disengagement, that's the main aspect of Chinese song lyric and Greek tragedy in my opinion. And public engagement is very important, on the other hand, in Confucianism and Christianity. So, for example, if we talk about private disengagement, the theme of impermanence and carpe diem, that is to enjoy the present, enjoy life right now. I believe that this theme is important both in the Chinese song lyric and in Western lyric poetry. For example, I put here some lines by Yan Shu, but there are countless examples that I could make. And on the other hand, we have some countless examples that can be made too when it comes to, for example, Greek poetry, Greek lyric poetry, Roman lyric poetry, or Renaissance lyric poetry. Here I put some famous lines by Horace: Dum loquimur fugerit invita etas, carpe diem quam minimum credula possero. While we're speaking in this time, we'll have flex as the day, trust in the future as little as possible. Well, I think many song lyrics show a very similar view of life, of how to overcome the sadness of life, the tragedy of impermanence, etc. But this is not the main subject, so now I will just limit myself to these general considerations and go on with my history of the reception of song lyric in the West. Another factor in the delay of the translation of the song lyric, I think, is the misogynistic views that were very common in 19th century Western societies. because even when it's not Christian missionaries who translated Chinese poetry, but lay people, they still show some prejudice toward the song lyric that they don't show toward shi poetry. And I think in general, many translators, for example, Davis, he said that, for example, the Han Gong Xiu, this drama, exposed the effeminacy of Chinese elite. So he wanted to condemn the feminine side of the elite. And so maybe this means that there was, they didn't want to translate a genre like Ci poetry, where actually there were, which is actually a very feminine literature by canonical and traditional standards. Another point, the Ci song lyric didn't have a documentary value as a source of knowledge of Chinese society, and so it was not so much appreciated by 19th century translators. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we start to see some signs of change, in particular with the figure of Judith Gautier, a young French translator, a woman, who in the second edition, published in 1902, of her famous Le Livre de Jade, the Book of Jade, a collection of Chinese poetry in French translation, for the very first time in an important book that I found, she translated some Ci, some song lyrics by Li Qingyang, 6 song lyrics. So Judith Gautier was different than the previous translators. She was not a Christian missionary, of course, and she was not a diplomat. She approached Chinese poetry because she liked it, because she had an aesthetic interest into Chinese poetry, and not because of her duty, not because she was a missionary or a diplomat. So not for reason of duty, but for pleasure, for aesthetic pleasure.
Excuse me, 5 minutes left, okay?
Oh, thank you. So it's important to stress here that it was a woman who translated Chinese Ci poetry for the first time in an important book, and we have said that Ci was very much connected with the female world in China as well. And Pauline Yu has suggested that Judith Gautier identified somehow herself in Li Qingyang, because they were both daughters of a scholar, both married to a scholar from whom they would be later separated, but for different reasons. So there was maybe an attempt at identification on the part of Gautier. We don't have time to talk in detail about her translation style. Anyway, it was very much domesticating, very much of a rewriting. She changed the meaning of the Chinese original in many cases. Like we can see here, I underlined some lines where the meaning is changed. The meaning is slightly or not slightly changed. And in some other instances, here I put them in italics, she even added words that are not, they are absent in the original. So she even invented her words. So this is her, this is some very quick considerations about her translation style. Prejudice on the song lyric was still widespread actually in the early 20th century, despite Judith Gautier's translation. For example, in 1918, Arthur Welly wrote that the content of the Ci is generally wholly conventional and that they are unsuitable for translation since their whole merit lies in metrical dexterity. So there was an attempt to diminish the aesthetic significance of the Ci song lyric. And in 1923, the same Arthur Welly also wrote that Ci was concerned chiefly with the pathetic and that its subject matter is so unvarying that it ceases to occupy the mind at all. So this is what Arthur Welly thought in early 20th century about the song lyric. But in the 1930s, there was a turning point because Clara Candlin, a British woman, another woman, and it's important to stress that, published the very first English book dedicated to song lyrics in 1933, The Herald Wind, approximately 60 song lyrics translated. And we don't have time to deal with the translation style here, but as you can see, she split the Chinese verses, the Chinese lines into more than one translated line. So this is the result. Why in the 1930s?
Sorry, there's still 3 minutes, okay.
Oh, thank you. I go to the conclusion. So why in the 1930s this change, this turning point in the translation? Because we had a parallel phenomena in China and in the West during that period. In China, in the early 20th century, we had a weakening of Confucian morality, the collapse of the bureaucratic class. So this led to a reevaluation of the song lyric. This was done also by Hu Shi. Hu Shi wrote a preface for Clara Candlin's first translation of song lyric. So this shows there was actually a link between what was happening in China with the reevaluation of the song lyric in the early 20th century and what was happening in the West with a new wave of translations of the song lyric. In the West, we see a weakening of Christian influence on translators because as also Professor Hu has pointed out, for example, saying that James Legg's translation of the Shizing was very different from Weilei's translation. Weilei didn't have so much, he wasn't so much concerned with Christian or Confucian ideological aspects, but with literary aspects. So what does it mean? That there was a release in the sensorial pressure, both in the source culture and target culture. Morality was not a way of censoring the song lyric anymore. And so the art was liberated from morality, from ethic function that it had for a very long time, and returned to the domain of aesthetics. So the song lyric, both in the West and in China during the 20th century, was liberated from this concern with its moralities, with its unorthodox morality, both by Confucian and Christian standards. And finally, it was appreciated as a form of art, as a form of literature. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just about time, and then Leo and
yes, I'm back.
right
Yeah.
in the nick of time. Yeah, so I will give the floor back to you again.
Yeah. So any questions raised with regard to Massimiliano's presentation, his paper on translation of Chinese song lyrics?
Well, I have a question for both Massimiliano and Fusheng, and this concerns about the kind of information the translator about the ongoing exegetical tradition in China at the time, at the Qing time. So they were more, partial to the Han Tang interpretive tradition, because at the time, so the Zhuxi tradition was basically, thrown out of the window, and then it is the Mao tradition, the stage comeback. So that, and also the philological tradition. So they pay a lot of attention to the study of the text and the cultural origin, ritual association of images, and then reread the poem. So I do not know to what extent Master Weilei's cultural informant were aware of those trends. I assume they were aware. And then which particular school of interpretation they were associated with. So there's a lot of work can be done to identify that really the more specific, not just Confucian tradition, not even just the Han, the Mao tradition versus the Zhuxi tradition, but the particular text, the text, exegetical text that may have an impact of a choice. And also, I think probably Massimiliano's paper, you can make it more convincing and more sophisticated by going beyond this kind of a very neat comparison between the Christian emphasis and the traditional Confucian moral emphasis, their agenda. There are things that are much more complex than this. For example, So the shift from the moral to the more literal reading of Shi Jing as love poems was already on the way in the Qing scholarship, particularly two persons, Fang Yurun and Yao Jiheng. They were already gradually moving away from the Mao tradition and began to interpret it, because in the Song tradition, Zhu Xi and Ouyang Xiu, they also try to recontextualize. They dispute the Mao tradition, saying that 断章取义. So they try to really 以义立志. I think 以义立志 is really the time when the Song scholar, they began to apply. And they try to emphasize, and the reading has to be supported by the context, by the evidence. But what the Qing scholar did, I mean, particularly after the mid-Qing, was really try to get out of the shadow of the Mao and just forget about those moral baggage. They could not do it completely, but they were also on the way, at least more than half. So the Wen Yi Do at the beginning of the 20th century is immediately a continuation of the native interpretive tradition, but also, of course, given impetus by the development of like the French Canale and the others, and also the May 4th movement, going back to the folk tradition to regenerate Chinese literature. So it's a convergence of many factors that lift the shift from this kind of moralistic interpretation to a more literary understanding of the poem. So that like Wen Yi Do's interpretation of Shi Jing is totally has totally dispensed with the traditional moralist tradition. And we are still indebted to that, to him and other people in the 30s and 30s for making that drastic turn. Finally, undo the influence of the Mao, the moralistic tradition. So these are the different factors. Probably, we could explore and then make our argument more nuanced and probably more, yeah, I'm not saying the direction you're following is not convincing, but you can make your argument more convincing by looking at those factors. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsai. It was a very useful suggestions, and I'm very happy to have the chance now to review this paper according to your suggestions to make it more nuanced. Thank you. Thank you for your suggestions.
Well, and Leo, other participants, any questions? Yeah.
Well, may I be allowed? It's just a tiny comment. So
yes, Yulia.
Yes. So thank you, Massimiliano, for this wonderful presentation. Like, I'm also interested in translating poetry, and what I want to say is that, judging here from this Russian tradition of translating poetry, we see that the song lyrics, so the Zi, was translated already back in the 1880s. So one of the first sinologists who was particularly interested in writing about Chinese literature is Vasily Vasilyev. He was the author of a book entitled Essays on the History of Chinese Literature. And as part of this book, he also translated some song lyric. But and I think that other people of his generation, they were also greatly interested in translating the song lyric, because they used to share a kind of a anthropological perspective. So they saw it as a form deeply connected to the folk tradition, and they were really interested in the folk tradition. So for them, that was really important. And that was just a tiny comment about the translating song lyric in the greater European tradition. So like it was a bit earlier here in Russia. Yeah.
Thank you, Yulia. I wasn't aware of these Russian translators of the 19th century, so I'm very happy also to learn about this, and I will also put it in my reviewed paper so I can give a more complete version of the story about Western translations of song lyrics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
We still have a little time.
Yeah. Wang Ying is
minutes,
raising
yes.
it.
Oh, okay, just
Yeah,
one
yeah.
comment. So it's interesting that the two earlier translators of song lyric are women, female translators, and also translating Li Qingzhao's poetry. It's interesting, however, I think it's a misconception that song lyric is feminine, because when it reached its peak in song time, it's actually replacing the so-called poetry, becoming the most popular poetic form. And it includes 3 different styles. So 格律派, 豪放派, and 婉约派. So there are many masculine song lyrics representatives, including Xin Qiji, Su Shi, etc. Even Ouyang Xiu is, so I think that maybe when you try to use the feminine perspective, to include the feminine perspective in your paper, this is really not the complete picture of the, the song lyric. In other words, it's a misconception. It's a misconception. It's not really representing the whole picture of the song lyric. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I apologize for oversimplifying during my presentation. In the paper, I expressed the difference, like I were more specific, but here, in the rush of time, I oversimplified. So I want to thank you for giving me the chance to clarify this aspect. So what I wanted to say is that these feminine associations are typical of the so-called Wang Pai, as you have reminded. And so this orthodox, let's say, current of song lyrics, as it's been identified by a Ming critic who called it Wang Yue. Yes, when I referred to this, I just wished to refer to this mainstream tradition of song lyrics. But of course, as you have justly reminded, there were other traditions. In the 11th century, Su Shi started this, the tradition that would later be known as Haofang. But Xin Qiji was actually much more into this, let's say, male rhetoric. Thank you again for giving me the chance to clarify, because I oversimplified during my speech. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that Massimiliano, you can look at the chat box. There are comments by other participants.
Okay, thank you.
And examples are given of earlier translations of Zi in this posting by Ling Jie. So you can check that out as well. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for for giving rise to a very enlightening discussion on the topic. Now let's move on to the third presenter, Lin Qingyang from Lingnan University. She is research assistant professor at the Department of Translation of Lingnan University. And she's going to talk about the sinological connection in the inception of Arthur Waley's translation of classical Chinese poetry. Well, Arthur Waley again, right? So all 3 of you have touched on this guy. And let's see what Dr. Lin has to say about Arthur Waley. Lin?
Is there?
Okay, I need to unmute myself. Yeah, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll share my screen. Okay, is it? Can you all see my
Yes.
screen now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you, Professor Chen, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining me here. As you can see here, my paper is also on Arthur Waley. And for my presentation, I'll be looking at a different period in Waley's career, and that's the very beginning of his translations from the Chinese, which saw a series of publications on classical Chinese poetry in the late 1910s to the early 1920s. These translations inaugurated Waley's career and had a defining influence on how classical Chinese poetry was received in the Western world. So this paper is about the inception of Waley's career, and I will focus in particular on the sinological connection, by which I mean Waley's engagements with the sinological sphere of translation. And when we talk about sinological sphere of translation, we are also referring to a larger field of translating Chinese literature in the early 20th century, where there are different groupings of translators and diverse modes of translation and transcultural rewriting. What I'm trying to do in this paper is to correlate these different layers of analysis and spheres of transcultural rewriting. And this presentation, following the structure of the paper, will be divided roughly into two parts. Firstly, I'll try to situate Waley in the field of translating Chinese poetry. I will explore how Waley positioned himself in relation to other practices in the field and try to trace his interchange with different networks of agents in the field of cultural production. And then secondly, in the second half of the presentation, I would zoom in more closely on the sinological sphere by examining a heated debate between Waley and Herbert Giles, who was the prominent sinologist of his time and the Cambridge professor of Chinese. Okay. I'll start the first part. When Waley started out translating classical Chinese poetry in the late 1910s, he had several well-trodden paths before him. He might follow the footsteps of the 19th century British sinologists. Although Chinese poetry had remained in a relatively marginal position in the sinological discourse, by the late 19th century, we saw a series of retranslations of the Shi Jing, and translations of classical Chinese poetry began to proliferate in the sinological discourse. These sinologists also wrote for the home literary market, clothing their translations with poetic garments familiar to the Victorian reading public, chiefly by the use of conventional verse forms and the substitution of culturally specific terms. The widely influential works of Herbert Giles further brought Chinese literature, and especially Chinese poetry, to greater prominence both in the sinological sphere and among the general reading public. The remarkable volume and range of Giles's sinological output, his quarter-century-long service as consular officer in various parts of China, his subsequent appointment in 1897 to the chair of Chinese and Cambridge, and the dual publication of his works by the China Coast publisher Kelly and Walsh and other major London publishing houses had contributed to the wide circulation and acclaim of Giles's works on Chinese literature. The works of Giles and other sinologists had a deeper effect than the widening of general readership. The literary cosmopolites, in their pursuit of the new poetry, set out to retranslate, adapt, imitate, and write about Chinese poetry, integrating it into the cultural landscape of the early 20th century. They are the poet translators, who did not have direct knowledge of the Chinese language and yet felt a special affinity with the poetic spirit of Cathay. They translated indirectly, that is via textual intermediaries or some form of collaboration, in the transatlantic networks of the modernist private presses, little magazines, and poetry clubs. Diverse rewritings of Chinese poetry proliferated, and Ezra Pound's Cathay, the celebrated example of modernist creative appropriation of classical Chinese poetry, came out in 1915. So by the early 20th century, classical Chinese poetry had gained a conspicuous presence in the sinological sphere, among the reading public in the home market, where classical Chinese poetry assumes the traditional verse forms of English poetry, and also among the avant-garde literary circles, where philological accuracy was disregarded or even considered a hindrance, and creative transcultural rewriting was embraced. Being the assistant keeper of the Oriental subdepartment of prints and drawings in the British Museum, who was progressing rapidly with his Japanese and Chinese studies, and a member of the Bloomsbury group, whose sensibility was steeped in the new literary currents of the time, Whaley was not content with any of these options. If we take a look at the list of Whaley's publications or translations during this period here, we will see that he actually traversed the regions of the sinological translators and at the same time the poet translators, and his practices interrelates the sinological and literary spheres of translation. First of all, there is the privately printed Chinese poem. It was the Bloomsbury painter and art critic Roger Fry who first encouraged Whaley to publish his translation. And he initially wished to publish it with his Omega workshop, which was a precursor to the Hogarth press of Leonard and Virginia Woolf. And then we also see a series of publications by Whaley in the sinological sphere with the Bulletin of the Oriental Studies. Running parallel with this is the appearance of Whaley's translation in the modernist little magazines, notably in the Little Review and Poetry. And shortly afterwards, these translations appeared in book form. First of all, 170 Chinese poems came out with Constable in 1918. And then a year afterwards, more translations from Chinese came out with Allen and Unwin, which became Whaley's publisher for the subsequent decades. From this brief account, we learned that Whaley's translations engaged the sinological sphere, the general reading public, and the literary avant-garde. This is an index of Whaley's knowledge of the field of translating Chinese poetry, and he definitely had a particular feel for the game. The affiliation with the British Museum and the School of Oriental Studies, and moreover, his personal connections with the Bloomsbury Group and the wider circles of poets, writers, critics, and editors endowed Whaley with the cultural and social capital to sustain his work. These intersecting networks, personal and professional, facilitated Whaley's unique entrance into the field of translating Chinese poetry and the subsequent trajectory of his translation practices. His translation has this Janus-like quality that addresses both the literary and the sinological sphere. And I will try to show how he was able to engage both spheres by examining his interactions with the networks of agents in the field and the textual and paratextual spaces of his translation. So first of all, there is this Whaley's interchange with the network of agents that he's associated with. The response from his circle of literary friends on the privately printed volume Chinese Poems gave Whaley initial ideas about how to further pursue his translation. Indeed, the publication of these translations in book form was warmly encouraged by Whaley's friends in Bloomsbury. For example, quoted here on the slide is a remark from Lytton Strachey, written in a letter to Whaley. Strachey wrote, "The vista of folly and ignorance you open up are alarming. I wish you would write a book on Chinese literature. It is badly wanted." Whaley was also contacting his publisher to make sure that his works will be known and reviewed in both circles. He wrote to his publisher, that's Allen Unwin. He wrote to Mr. Stanley Unwin to draw the attention of Kelly and Walsh to more translations so that it will appear in their catalog of books on China. He also asked Unwin to send a copy of more translations to the literary magazine Coterie, which also published the poems of W.H. Davis and T.S. Eliot. And now moving on to the paratextual and textual spaces of Whaley's translation, we can also see Whaley's acts of position taking in the field. First of all, Wei describes his translations of Chinese poetry as an experiment in English unrhymed verse. His choice of this medium for translation partakes in the spirit of innovation in the verse culture of the time. When poets are vigorously rethinking the expressive capabilities of the English language, Wei's experiment is thus an act of position taking that aligns his translations with the emergent practice of new verse forms. But to regard Wei's translation solely as a means to reform English poetry is to obscure the other important dimension of Wei's practice as a sinologist, poet, translator. Although Wei was interested to explore what Chinese poetry might bring to the rejuvenation of English poetry, he had taken care to distance his practices from what he later called the pseudo-Chinese. And he did this by demarcating a sphere of proper translation. He wrote, "I have aimed at literal translation, not paraphrase. It may be perfectly legitimate for a poet to borrow foreign themes and material, but this should not be called translation." So what Wei is doing here is, try to distinguish his own translation from other contemporary practices by defining what should and should not be called translation, and by drawing a boundary between what lies within translation proper and what lies beyond it. Within the legitimate boundary of translation defined by Wei, literalness, which can be understood here as accuracy in verbal meaning, shall be one of the primal concerns. And this implicitly disqualifies those who do not have sufficient knowledge of the Chinese language from performing the task of translation. Furthermore, Wei explained that his decision against using rhyme is partly made on the basis of this concern for literalness. He wrote, "I have not used rhyme because it is impossible to produce in English rhyme effects that are at all similar to those of the original, where the same rhyme sometimes runs through a whole poem. Also, because the restriction of rhyme necessarily injure either the vigor of one's language or the literalness of one's versions. I do not, at any rate, know of any example to the contrary." Wei thus differentiated his practice not only from the freely adaptive methods of the poet translators, but also some of the sinologist translators, whose efforts in sustaining regular rhyme schemes is detrimental to literal accuracy. These features in the paratext of translation can be read as implicit statements of sinological competence, which is further put forth in Wei's selection of poems. He wrote, "In making this book, I have tried to avoid poems which have been translated before. 140 of those I have chosen have not been translated by anyone else. The remaining 30-odd I have included in many cases because the previous versions were full of mistakes." Here we see a very firm statement of sinological competence, implying the ability to undertake original scholarship and the attempt to correct previous mistakes made by other sinologists. The bibliographic notes appended in Wei's 170 Chinese poems passes judgments on 12 works published in Europe on Chinese poetry. So I've listed some quotations here. These are Wei's descriptions of, or his comments of other European sinologists' works on Chinese literature. With such strong proclamations of originality and competence, Wei's translation cannot fail to attract the attentions of the Cambridge professor of Chinese, Herbert Giles. We know that Giles was not only the prominent sinologist of his time, he was also a man of many quarrels, who was wont to use the term demolition to describe his treatment of fellow sinologists' works. The entry on Giles in Samuel Cooling's Encyclopedia Sinica noted that Giles has always been a keen controversialist and has dealt ruthlessly with all that he considered false scholarship in Chinese studies. When Wei entered the sinological scene with his translations of classical Chinese poetry, Giles deemed it incumbent on him to give his verdict on Wei's sinological qualifications. What ensued was the high noon duel, to use Timothy Barrett's phrase. between Herbert Giles and Arthur Waley. A prolonged debate unfolded on the pages of the Cambridge Review and the New China Review, and it is carried out, as you can see from some of the titles here, in the form of retranslations and notes on the interpretation of particular phrases or passages of the Chinese texts. During their exchange, the idea of literalness is brought up again and again and becomes the center of contention. We know that literalness is a key concept in discussions of translation, but it is also a very elusive concept with different aspects of meaning, which is rather complicated, and I won't have time to go into details here. But
you have 5 minutes more, Lynn.
Yes, I'm nearing the end of my presentation actually. Okay, thank you for that. So this idea of literalness is a key concept in the discussion of translation, but it is also a elusive concept with different aspects of meaning. And in my paper, I have tried to unravel this multifaceted idea of literalness, which is rather complicated, and I won't have time to go into details here. But my point is that during the Giles versus Waley debate, this idea of literalness serves the discursive function of opening up an arena for contesting sinological competence and establishing scholarly credibility. In this exchange, the demands of offering a poetically appealing translation for the general reader are brushed aside, and the contestation of philological correctness and what qualifies for a proper sinological translation takes center stage. Here we see that retranslation, together with the accompanying notes and commentaries, becomes a form of crossing swords on sinological grounds. Each party draws upon his particular set of skills and resources, mobilizing and garnering sinological capital during the exchange. In my paper, I have discussed several concrete examples that reveal the set of resources and skills that Waley and Giles drew upon during the debate. For Giles, there is the connection with China Coast sinology, his fund of first-hand empirical experience in the China field, and his position of advantage as the Cambridge professor of Chinese. And for Waley, there is this strong emphasis on textual knowledge. He insisted that this grounding in philological evidence should be the foundation of a fair debate. He also makes use of his parallel study of Japanese and quotes Japanese sources to support his reading of these Chinese texts. The various kinds of resources mobilized in this debate reveal the intellectual formation of Giles, the China field veteran and sinological doyen of his time, and Waley, who was rooted in the metropolitan milieu of the British Museum and whose approach to the Far East was primarily textual. Waley tested his mettle during this exchange, which had a formative influence on his sinological practice and how he positioned himself in the field of translating Chinese literature. I have 2 more slides here, but I think I'll skip this and I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Okay.
your paper ties up very well with the previous 2 papers, you see, by Professor Wu and then Massimiliano. So I guess this would be enough material for a good discussion. Literary versus a sinological approach to translating Chinese poetry, a theme shared by more or less by these 3 presentations. So anyone wants to take the first shot?
And
I'll jump in.
Could you give me, I'm just being a little bit, straightforward, and I'm curious to know how many % of the material presented, and other new material you yourself discover, and about his contact, his correspondence, and have this been discussed previously by other people? If not, yeah.
No, these are, I think these are my, archival work, actually. I've spent quite a few time in the George Allen Unwin archive, which was also extensively studied by Professor Qi Lintao, our presenter in the previous session. That's the George Allen Unwin archive. Allen Unwin is Whaley's chief publisher, and they have this, very well curated archive in the University of Reading. So the publisher's archive from there are my, sort of own archival work. And also there is a another part of material which I discussed, which is the debates between Herbert Giles and Arthur Whaley. Those debates are published in the Cambridge Review and the New China Review, and I don't think they've been discussed at length in other publications. I haven't seen any in-depth discussions of these debates before. Although there was a paper by Timothy Barrett, which was called Herbert Giles as a Reviewer. I think that was published in 2018 or 2019. He also touched upon this debate between Whaley and Giles, but his main approach is about Giles's kind of practice as a reviewer, and he's not actually discussing this back and forth exchange between Whaley and Giles.
Okay, that's very good. I think probably you should, at the very beginning of the paper, tell the audience and tell the reader the kind of your approach, your archival approach, and what you discover, and so that people have a clear idea and better appreciate your finding, your solid archival work. That would be very significant.
Thank you. I will.
And also, I think probably one way probably to lift your discovery to an even higher standard of the significance is to think about incorporating some theoretical issue, give you a kind of framework. For example, you can frame your article as idea of this in a self-positioning, and how the translator consciously positioning himself, vis-a-vis the translator, the sinologist, and then how he negotiates different traditions very successfully. Success measured by the reception, and by the time, and how they prove something like that, But that will be very,
yes.
That gives you a work in which it's just not an archival discovery, but also you can tease out the theoretical significance of your findings. Yeah, I think this kind of archival work is very important. I think for people engaged in our project, I think doing this kind of work, that will be, because whatever you say, you rest on solid ground, on empirical, the result of empirical research. Yeah. So this is my observation. I appreciate all that you have done. I think it's very promising. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Tsai. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Daniel has raised his hand. Daniel, yeah.
Daniel?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Qingyang. What a wonderful paper. I really enjoyed listening to it. The debate between Giles and Whaley was new to me, so that was great that you're introducing that, and I think highlighting it is super. One point of comparison, so the debate between the literary and the scholarly, I believe you could make at least a brief comparison between what happened between Abu Musa and Stanislas, and because if you read, even it wasn't a simultaneous debate, but it was unfortunately for Abu Musa a posthumous debate. He was dead, and Julien was attacking his translation and accusing it of being of indulging, the kind of literary sensibility over the sinological sensibility. And there are a couple of instances then where Abel Musa's other students come to his posthumous defense, and the terms of the debate sound somewhat, not exactly similar, but they maybe echo in some interesting way what you see going on between what you've described. I haven't read the materials that you're talking about with Giles and Whaley, but maybe a little bit of an echo there, or a little bit of a reprise of a similar debate that happened somewhat earlier, but in a different cultural context.
Yes, yes. Oh, thank you. That's very helpful. I think there are, many kind of echoing episodes between these warring sinologists arguing with each other, in the periodicals or or whatever. Yes, thank you.
Yes, Fusheng.
Yeah, just to draw your attention. So, yeah, I mean, your research is very thorough in English, and it's very impressive. And I glanced through your paper. Yeah, without being kind of self-promoting, I did a book in Chinese. It's called, and actually on the chapter on Giles or Whaley, there is I did a section on the debate. Between the two of them, and that would be very directly related to your really like Song Zongqi's point, how really does a translator position himself, especially for someone like Whaley, compared to Giles. At that time, he was just a starter, So yeah, just to.
Yes, I'll definitely, reference that. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Well, yes.
Okay, I thought you disappear again.
No, well, I kind of went out and then came back in and went out again, and the connection was so unstable. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for the presentation.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the next presentation, also on Chinese poetry, by Yulia Dreyzis. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. She is Associate Professor of the Chinese Philology Department, Institute for Asian and African Studies of Moscow State University, and a researcher at the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So a very interesting paper that I've read on translating the cryptic East, Perceptions of Chinese Classical Poetry in 20th Century Russia. Now the floor is yours, Yulia.
Oh, thank you so much. So the paper is centered around showing the evolution of translating Chinese classical poetry, 20th century Russia. So there is a tendency I see moving from kind of a domesticating translation, to borrow Professor Wu's term, to the kind of a foreignizing translation. And it's also a tendency that is connected to involving more and more poet translators into this translation. So what we see here at the beginning of the 20th century, there are two parallel lines of developing literary translation. So these are translations by poetry translators, because the beginning of the 20th century here in Russia is the silver age of Russian poetry, and many of the great modernist poets, they really enjoyed translating Chinese classical poetry, and like the paper starts from such an example, and I also I couldn't drop the Julie Gauthier book and its influence on the Russian tradition of translating classical Chinese poetry, because the Book of Jade was really popular in Russia, because many of the people were fluent in French, so they really enjoyed reading it. And that's why maybe one of the greatest poets of the beginning of the 20th century, Nikolai Gumilov, he also made his own book of poetry that was directly inspired by the Book of Jade, and was a kind of a reinterpretation of it. And the book was entitled The Porcelain Pavilion. It came out in 1918. The title is also one of the titles of Gautier's translations. The book preserves the theme, the plot, the general mood of the original. But what Gumilev does, he rewrites the rhythmic prose that Gautier uses with a regular verse, he eliminates the breakdown into any thematic subsections, and he makes his own selection of poems. Because the tradition of translating any poetry as a rhymed one in Russia here is very strong, and it was extremely strong at the beginning of the 20th century. So what really attracted Gumilev and his fellow poets here is that they were greatly influenced by the cult of artificiality and the idea of imitating nature in art, so characteristic of the French Parnassus school. And since these two aspects are also quite typical of Chinese poetics, both Russian poets and Gautier, they found it close to their kind of aesthetic choices. So the parallels between those paradigms of Gumilev and Gautier, they become apparent precisely in the light of their interaction with the Chinese poetic tradition. And Chinese poetry also attracted both authors with its emotional restraint, with its attitude to the poetic text as a kind of an artifact, but not a duplicate of its rich lack of accuracy in the indication of the sources utilized reflects the perception of the idea that the presence of a company of fellow poets serves as an important catalyst of the creative process, and it's enough. And the poem becomes a kind of a collective property. And also implementing this the Chinese traditional practice of exchanging poetry between friends. Gumilev freely borrows from Gautier, creating a verse that is at the same time seeks to be original. So this is what many poets do. But also there is a strong tradition of sinologists translating Chinese classical poetry. And when we look at these types of texts, what we see is that social order was inscribed within the translation of classical Chinese poetry. So a translation was addressed to a reader who acted within a framework of the kind of a national cultural tradition and was forced to reckon with this tradition. So the task posed to the translators of classical Chinese poetics text was not really poetic, strictly speaking. It was instead a cultural one, which obviously didn't involve resorting to a method of linguistic thinking unknown to the reader. So the translation was the translation based on a deliberate lack of possible self-sufficiency or possible incomprehensibility of the meaning, implied the presence of some additional explication of comments of various kinds. And in this kind of Russian Soviet tradition, a model of cultural and historical commentary almost not affecting the principles of poetics has developed. So almost all the poems published were always published with substantial commentary. And the task of the translator was presented in some formula like introducing into the Russian culture or introducing the Russian reader to something, so which led to the priority of conveying the meaning of the original in the target language, so in Russian in this case. So indeed, the classical translations from Chinese made in the 20th century, they present a simplification in relation to the original text because, well, due to both restrictions imposed by syllabotonic versification, that was the mainstream type of versification practice used in the 20th century in Russia, and conventional syntax, and also a kind of a correlation with Russian Romantic poetry of the 19th century that arises precisely from the usage of syllabotonic forms. And also an abuse of folklore components, because as I've already mentioned today, like many of the sinologists, they were really interested in researching Chinese folk traditions. And it seemed lawful to them to connect every type of poetry, starting from Shijing and down to the song lyric to the folk tradition. What I also try to do in the paper is kind of reconstruct a kind of a lineage, a kind of a genealogy of these translations made by many important scientists, because almost every sinologist in 20th century Russia had a try in translating classical poetry. After the war, after the Second World War, when the Great Friendship with China began, translations streamed in full flow. So there were thousands, like literally thousands of translations made. And then there was a tendency to view the text as a thing that needed to be domesticated. And when we look at those translations that were made for different purposes, for purely scientific to educational, they all look the same in that they use the language of Russian Romantic poetry of the 19th century with its historicism, with its metaphorics. And this is a kind of an ambiguous approach, because if we accept the controversial strategy of archiving that translation language of any classical text, then still the question arises, so well, how does, for example, the 8th century in China correlate with the 19th century in Russia? Because when we turn to the tradition of Russian poetry, we turn to 19th century tradition of Romantic inspired poetry. So the original language played a subordinate role in relation to the translation language, and the structure of contemporary Russian verse simultaneously evolving in this process also provided poet translators with some new opportunities for poetic translation. So, and they started exploring those possibilities with the new perspectives, starting from some underground poetry activities in the 60s and 70s. What they started doing in the 60s and 70s, they, instead of expanding the so-called meaning of the Chinese text in Russian, they were starting to develop a kind of turning Russian into Chinese thing. So language was translated directly into language. And that's why it can be seen as a kind of a new perspective. We don't say that they don't speak Russian like this. We say like they potentially do speak Russian like this. They already speak Russian like this. And we choose the experimental form. These, paradoxically, these kind of experiments of the second part of the 20th century, they are rooted in some theoretical elaborations by a very famous Russian sinologist, Alexeyev. Because Alexeyev, he put forward the requirement of scientific accuracy of the translation, which for him implied attention to the number and principles of word selection. So he was really keen on counting the Chinese characters and translating every character with a separate word in Russian, which is really hard to do. This requirement echoes the paradoxical demand for verbatimity, as was put forward by Walter Benjamin. So on the other hand, the scientifically accurate translation, according to Alexeyev, implies that not a single word is missed out in the original that would not have affected the translation in any way or another. And ideally, the original should correspond as closely as possible to the word-for-word translation, as far as it's achievable when we speak about two languages with really different linguistic structures. On the other hand, Alexeyev proposed a formal principle that is connected to not counting the function words. So what he omitted the function words, and that's why he was quite successful with these types of translations. So he was the one who proposed the idea, and he also implemented those kinds of translations. Experimenting with those new kind of texts culminates in conceptualist poetry in the 70s and in the 80s. It is combined with a kind of a phonetic and visual assimilation of Chinese tradition in Russian poetry, simultaneously with making new translations directly from Chinese. One of the really interesting experiments is some poetry translations by Natalia Azarova, who is a very famous linguist and also a very famous contemporary poet. And she made a great project, so a large book, with new translations made from Dufu. And she tries to retransmit the syntactic and semantic ambiguity of traditional Chinese poetry directly into Russian text. So, for example, she uses a nominative series which is really not that typical for standard Russian phrases, to locate the words next to each other in a kind of associative rather than a syntactic connection. So imitating a kind of a classical literary Chinese stylistics. So, and she uses what Charles Olson called composition by field, or the movement across the entire surface of the page where the eye moves and sees different vertical connections inside the text. And this kind of a joint reading of words that are adjacent vertically, which can be found in classical poetry, is used here as a device for deepening, for exponentiation of the meaning. So therefore, we have a plurality of meanings as a kind of a sign of poetic language. This vertical interaction of language signs creates the possibility of non-linear movement along the text. I will try to show an example, like I'll just show the book and the way the Chinese text and its Russian translation is presented inside the book. Here we see the Chinese original as it is presented in the book. And here is the Russian translation. So the words are much longer, but still what the poet tries to do is to keep them short, like as short as possible. So they will be corresponding to the characters. So one character corresponds to one word in Russian. So it's a kind of a very formalistic approach. It's creates, so in other poems we also see this type of thing. And it's very characteristic for contemporary Russian poetry that is very formalist in this sense. So very much attention is paid to the formal aspect. So the contemporary Russian translators, they do not dwell solely on the imagery of the tradition. They are not that much interested in the imagery, but rather in the mechanics of the text. So the quantitative principle plays the most important role, not only in relation to the number of words per line, but also in relation to the size of the text as such. So we organize the text in such a way so that it can be grasped at once and it can be placed on one page in the book. So in such a criterion as the length of the poem, the difference between Western and Eastern poetry is especially noticeable. If we turn to Russian classical poetry, it becomes even more evident. So in its most general form, this can be formulated as as follows: in the Western tradition, in Russian tradition, the length of the poem is determined by the genre and not by its visual appearance. So and the ability to simultaneously encompass it with the eye, like on a calligraphy scroll, for example, is left somewhere. But here, the idea is that if we cut a poem into several pages of printed text, it will destroy the substance of poetry.
You have 5 minutes more, Yulia.
Yeah, I'm almost there. So, and due to this kind of a dictate of visuality in the culture of the second part of the 20th century at the beginning of the 21st century, this criterion becomes surprisingly relevant to contemporary verse. So the location of text, of the text on the page, its configuration as a whole is not only an important expressive means, it also is a means of creating rhythm and more broadly meaning formation. So it also is connected to the concept of graphic text design, which is also extremely important for contemporary Russian poetry. So that's why the poets choose not to use any punctuation marks. So not to break the text with the punctuation marks, or just containing them just minimally. And it's also very important that they don't use capital letters. So it's also a kind of a new principle, a new choice, because they see that it's connected to the idea that all Chinese characters in the original are the same. There are no larger characters, no capital characters. So that's why we should use no capital letters. It's also a kind of a new norm for contemporary Russian poetry. And it allows one to kind of correlate the encoding in the Cyrillic alphabet with the Chinese character encoding. So, and the rejection of those capital letters is absolute, including in proper names and titles. They just don't use them anymore. And also the rhythm of the Chinese classical poetry, which is formed by a number of isomorphs, in particular homophones, and like going from tone to tone, and the movement of tones is also interpreted in some ways in contemporary Russian translations. So what the poets use is a kind of an anagrammatic construction to imitate the isomorphism of Chinese poetry. So we take the reduplications like the ones we saw in today's examples from Shijing, or like partial reduplications, and we reproduce them with using anagrammatic constructions. What is also interesting is that for the some previously considered to be untranslatable, those techniques of Chinese poetry are reinterpreted, and they also present a kind of a rethinking of the classics in a new way, using the possibilities, the development of poetic technique, the meta-language, the meta-linguistic reflection, and the idea of translation as a continuation of the life of the work seems greatly productive for contemporary Russian translators. So what we see here is a great shift of the paradigms. So, and it also can be observed with some examples, more examples to be shown here, but I will omit this example part because I understand that it's very hard for people who don't speak Russian to have a look at those things, because I have to translate it all the way into English. And what I did in the paper, I also provided the transliterations of the Russian texts. So at least maybe they will be useful in some kind of ability to look at them in this way. I think I'm through with it. So any comments are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for telling us so much about the Russian language and the possibility of using it to translate Chinese. It's not often that we hear a presentation on Chinese-Russian translation. It's probably the first one I've heard in my my career of some 30 years. So thank you, Yulia. Questions from the floor?
I have a question about the so-called scientific accuracy school, or like translator or translation. Because when you translate poetry, you deal with music, you deal with linguistic expression, you deal with literariness. And then usually you have to pay attention to form as well as meaning, right? As well as artistic quality. So my question is whether, because I'm ignorant of Russian, so I don't know whether, I know that it is extremely difficult in English to do this, you know, word by word, word versus word, kind of like a translation. Now you have 5 words in Chinese, actually 5 characters, not necessarily, you know, 5 or 7 characters in Chinese, and then versus 7 words or 5 words in Russian. So then my question is whether, how do you evaluate the quality of the poetry, like the Russian translation, as you describe it? Just pay attention to the form. Similarly, pay attention to the form. Do they actually, in other words, so this is at the cost of the meaning, or at the cost of the literariness or the poetic quality, or it's possible to actually do, you know, both, or all the aspects?
Well, of course, there's also always a tension that exists somewhere in between, like the formalist approach and the approach that goes more about the meaning, the kind of a semantic approach. So Alexeyev, who proposed the idea, he did it ingeniously. So he was a really good translator, because he also paid great attention to the musicality of the text. And what he what he started translating, his first translation experiments were not in the sh form, not in the zi form. What he did, he translated Hanfu. So that was a really a hard thing to do, because he chose those texts that were kind of prosymmetric texts. They had those poetry parts incorporated in them. They also had those rhythmically organized prose parts incorporated in them. So maybe this kind of texts, they were better suited for that kind of translation, because you still have some prose parts, rhythmically organized prose, and it's maybe easier to do it in prose. But it really is hard to do it in poetic form, mostly because Russian is not an analytic language. So like English corresponds far better to Chinese, because the words basically don't change that much. But if we come to these longer words with the necessity to change the forms, then it goes like it goes really hard. And then we come up to your main question, like sometimes when we have a look at those new translations, we see that they don't sound really good. And when we look at earlier translations made at the beginning of the 20th century, then we see that they sound much better. But maybe there's also a tension between the visual and the audio in translating poetry, because those newer translations, they're more visual. So they're aimed at a reader who will be reading them on the page, maybe on the web page, and who will be looking at the texts. While earlier translations, they were much often aimed at a reader who will be listening to them.
Thank you.
Yes, Yulia. Well, I have a question here. You will notice that reception is the word that is used most often, probably used most often in our two sessions, right, today. And so it appears to be quite unusual for you to say near the end of your paper that it seems that translation failures primarily stem from the problem of addressing orientation towards the general reader. You remember this sentence that you put in the second last paragraph. So this seems to be a denial of the relevance and importance of the reader, right, as the target of your translations. Well, we are very much indebted to the Russian formalists for introducing, reader reception and reader response and so on. So this statement is really surprising. I don't know if you would like to elaborate on it.
Well, maybe I didn't formulate it quite well, because the idea was that in the poetry of the second half of the 20th century, there is an idea in contemporary Russia that there is kind of no kind of general reader. There's no reader as such. So there are many different types of readers, and we're always oriented towards a particular type of reader. So there's no general readership. And I see that here's also an important shift to be observed. Like earlier poet translators or sinologists who are translating classical poetry, they saw themselves working for a kind of a general reader, like a kind of construction, abstract thing.
Hypothetical, yeah.
Yes, and the later translators, they also keep in mind what kind of reader will be interacting with their translation. That's maybe what I wanted to say. Like, for example, there's a kind of translation that is of course, better suited for a kind of a philologically orientated reader, for a poet, for instance, or like someone writing literature for, so this is poetry for poets sometimes, or like a poetry that is better suited for educational purposes. So there's a kind of a breakdown of the general reader into many different readers.
Okay. Well, maybe a second question. Listening to your presentation, I was reminded of the concept of translanguaging. When you talk about, you know, Chinese words and characters being carried over into the Russian translation. You mentioned interlanguage. Are you aware of the research that is being done on translanguaging or code switching or kind of adoption of one language into another through translation? Is that a relevant concern to your research in this paper?
Oh, thank you so much for the remark. I find it really interesting because I've got colleagues here from the Institute of Linguistics who do research on bilingual poetry. Well, they mostly explore bilingual poetry in Europe and in Latin America. So they're doing research on Latin American poetry using Spanish or Portuguese and many more languages like Guarani in Brazil or Paraguay. And I know that they've got research on this kind of code switching in poetry. So it will be, maybe it will be interesting to look at the text from this kind of perspective.
Yeah, there's actually a new book. I don't know if you are aware of it. It's called Translation and Translanguaging by Li Tongking. But you may want to just take a look at that. Anyway, thank you very much for giving us this chance to talk about, you know, Chinese-Russian relationship. Now, well, last but not least, we're having a paper on the translation of drama from Professor Wang Ying. Well, I'll get to this symposium, but she's working on a paper on the translation of drama. So your paper is the only one that's on drama that we're going to hear about. So thank you for you know, doing this for us. Professor Wang is Professor of Asian Languages Department of Mount Holyoke College, and she is going to talk about English translation of classical Chinese plays. Professor Wang.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers, Professor Tsai, Professor Chen, and Chris as well for organizing this wonderful symposium. I also want to thank all the participants. And this is really a learning and sharing experience. I also want to say hi to Stephen Roddy. Hi, Steve, and for introducing me to this symposium. Okay, so I share my screen. So the topic of my paper today is pragmatic strategies in English translation of classical Chinese plays. This study is divided into two parts. The first part explores the performability of classical Chinese plays by contextualizing it in the history and convention of Chinese theater and the practice of its intercultural translation and staging. The second part deals with the common practices of translating classical Chinese plays into English. The frequently adopted and currently prevalent model is identified as the Sikh translation and foreignization approach, in which the translator uses paratexts, annotations, and inner textual strategies to locate the text in a rich cultural and linguistic context. Kwame Anthony Abia was the first person to introduce the concept of Sikh translation to the field of translation study. According to him, there are two types of literary translation in dealing with the written literature. One is a translation that aims itself to be a literary work, and another is a translation that aims to be of use in literary teaching, translation that seeks with its annotations and its accompanying glosses to locate the text in a rich cultural and linguistic context. The literary translation that Abia had in mind is the latter, which to him meets the need to challenge ourselves and our students to go further, to undertake the harder project of a genuinely informed respect for others. The concept of thick translation seems to be consistent with the strategy of foreignization introduced by Lawrence Venuti. To him, foreignizing translation signifies the differences of the foreign text, deviating enough from native norms to stage an alien reading experience. The Sikh translation and foreignization approaches share their challenge of the homogeneous and monolingual orientation in the English translation practice and tradition by emphasizing the importance of preserving foreign features and an alien reading experience. They can serve as useful strategies for translating classical Chinese plays into English to deal with some untranslatable cultural and linguistic elements in the classical Chinese drama texts. For example, allusions, metaphors, and euphemistic expressions are culturally and linguistically significant, and sacrificing them in translation would lose the richness and profoundness of the underlying messages delivered in the dramatic text. However, they're usually rather difficult to translate directly or to explain elaborately in drama text. Resonated with the Sikh translation and foreignization approaches, some English translators of classical Chinese drama adopted various means within and without of the play script to deal with the so-called untranslatable elements. Specifically, these solutions can be mainly divided into three categories in terms of the spaces they occupy in the translated text. Informational materials outside of the play script, annotations attached to the play script, translating workarounds within the play script. The informational materials outside of the play script include the translator's forward, afterword, preface, introduction, glossary, and numerous types of appendices and paratexts related to the translation, including the playwright's life and works, the original play's additions, the related dramatic conventions, and scholarly criticism of the play in question. Some published English translations of classical Chinese drama stand out in using these materials to provide a rich cultural and literary context for the translated drama text. The story of the Western Wing, based on the 1498 Hongzhi edition by Stephen West and Weld Idema, serves as one such example. This is, the book was published in 1995. This rendition contains a long list of paratexts accompanying the annotated translation of the play script. The paratexts are divided into 4 different categories that include 4 items in the prefatory matter, 5 parts in the introduction and 2 appendices in addition to the reference tools such as a glossary, selected bibliography, and index. The introduction is so extensive and thorough that it takes up about 100 pages and encompasses most of the important aspects and issues related to Xixiangji in general and the 1498 edition in particular. The part entitled An Introduction to the World of the Western Wing, for instance, guides readers to understand the important allusions and images of the play, offering a cohesive and in-depth approach to the symbolic meaning and metaphorical system at work in the dramatic text. One good example is Idema's explanation of how the imagery of moon is used as a matrix that generates a net of allusions and images. As explained by Idema, the term wind and moon, feng yue, has a long tradition of use as a linguistic code for romantic twists and sexual encounters. Much of the major action of the play takes place under moonlight, and the play itself is even known by the variant title, Waiting for the Moon, 待月西厢. Readers are informed that Cui Ying's character also has a close association with the moon. All of her key scenes are set under the moon, including burning incense, exchanging poetry with Zhang Gong, listening to Zhang playing the zither, and visiting Zhang for their sexual consummation, etc. And she is consistently referred to as Chang'e, who is the goddess of the moon, being deprived of love and companionship and suffering from loneliness. In the play, the mystical story of Pei Hang, meeting a fairy at Indigo Bridge, Lanqiao, is also related to the moon, with the motif of a jade hair helping Pei make the elixir that enables his ascension to the celestial realm to join the fairy. Pei's story offers a contrastive case to Chang'e's tale, in which love is rewarded and made possible by a romantic and devoted man. This group of closely connected allusions and images works very well to portray and reflect the characters and emotions of Cui Ying and Zhang Gong and consolidate the love theme of the play. However, usually allusions such as Feng Yue, Chang'e, and Pei Hang will be translated and annotated separately whenever they appear in the dramatic text. And the holistic meanings underscored in them are not properly revealed to readers. As a result, the reader's proper understanding of the play can be hindered. Indeed, a holistic way of dealing with allusions, symbols, metaphors, and imageries is more effective in translating classical Chinese dramas such as Xixiangji. Although paratexts are not strictly limited in length and number because they are placed outside and do not compete for space with the play's text proper, occupying too much space may not fit into the design and budget of the publisher. Therefore, the translator must be selective in including the paratexts that are most useful for the translated play and the targeted readers. For instance, for historical plays such as The Palace of Eternal Life, Changsheng Dian, it may be necessary to provide a piece on the historical event of the Anshi Rebellion and the historical figures of Emperor Ming of the Tang Dynasty, Tang Ming Huang, and his imperial consort, Yang Yuhuan. In addition to various paratexts, footnotes, endnotes, or annotations attached to the text proper of the play provide another effective means to deal with the so-called untranslatable elements. And in Dang, they translated the play with a rather cultural, literary, and linguistic context. In providing annotations, we believe that they ought to be indispensable. Indispensable means high frequency usage of cultural and or generic significance, and essential to the meaning of the drama text. For instance, in Act 2 of the Volume 3 of Xixiangji by West and Idiom 1 aria by Hongyang criticizes Ying behind her back, and the aria goes, "Today in the upper room where you make your evening toilet, apricot blossoms fade, and yet you still fear the single layer of your gown. But amid the clear dew and bright moonlight, that whole Caesar listening hard last night did not fear spring's chill. You came close to be a gentleman's choice morsel." In translating this part, West provides the following annotation. What we have translated here as a gentleman is the term 先生, which in the original passage from Analects 2.8 actually means elders. Zixia asked about filiality, and the master said, "It is the face one puts on that is difficult. That young people should take on the burdens of affairs or give their elders wine and food to eat. Is this really filiality?" One favorite technique in drama is to quote phrases from the Analects out of context and give them a satirical twist. West tries to do three things here. First, he provides the original quote from Confucius' Analects, which the subject of filial piety is discussed. Using a rhetorical question, Confucius emphasized that filial piety is more than just serving elders with wine and food. It also involves respecting elders and parents and serving them with a pleasant manner and without complaints. Secondly, West reveals that this code is playfully twisted in Hongyang's aria by referring to Zhang Gong as the elder and by having Ying herself serve as Zhang's choice morsel. Thirdly, West also informs his readers that taking codes from Analects out of context and using them with a satirical twist is a favorite technique in Chinese drama. This example is a fitting one for footnotes being essential to the meaning of the drama text. The so-called high-frequency allusions include 牛郎织女,嫦娥偷药, 伯牙摔琴, 南柯一梦, 巫山云雨, etc. Examples such as 六里, 崔庄诗, 闹洞房, 红鸾星, 白虎星 are considered as expressions with cultural significance, and annotations should also be given for the purpose of providing a rich cultural and linguistic context for the reader. In his translation of the Peony Pavilion, Cyril Birch used some workarounds in dealing with both allusions and idiomatic expressions. In discussing his treatment of allusions, Birch says that he often used paraphrasing in addition to providing footnotes. His first strategy is to use quotation marks for literary idioms, famous sayings, and quotes from other literary works. For example, in his self-introduction in Scene 2, Liu Mengmei says, "My days are a days of thoughts of love, 每日情思昏昏," which is taken from Cui Ying's line, 正日甲情思睡昏昏 from 西厢记.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. In Scene 5, Dubao's words that jade, unsculpted, unfit for use, person, untutored, unaware of the way, 玉不琢, 不成器, 人不学, 不知道. It's a quote from the Book of Rites. The second strategy that Birch employed is to make the implied meaning explicit, or turn a metaphor into a simile. One such example is in scene 3, in which, in expressing gratitude to her parents for raising her in their old age, 杜丽娘 sings the line, 虽则是子生迟暮，守得见这蟠桃熟. Birch translated the 2 lines into 4 lines in English, which go, though the fairy peach comes only after 30 centuries to fruit, and even so, I, your child, was born of your evening years, yet with careful guarding, you bring me now to ripeness. So obviously, Pantau supposed to be a metaphor, and Birch made it a simile. Strategy 3, the third strategy that Birch adopted is to untangle and clarify an idiomatic expression by a free translation. The best example can be seen in scene 3, in which Du Liniang's mother hopes they could find a son-in-law to bring honors and high social status to the Du family. The word for bringing honors and high social status for one's parents-in-law is 做门楣 in Chinese. And Madame Du's words in the original are 做门楣古语 为神的这絮絮叨叨才到中年路. And Birch's translation goes, when the Emperor of Tang showered favors on Yang Guifei, honored consort, families wished for a girl to be born them rather than a son. Now you're in your middle years, why indulge in this complaining? This part about Yang Guifei winning the doting of Emperor Ming of the Tang, and being envied by parents who had sons is not in the original Chinese, but was added by Birch in his translation. However, although this addition is Birch's free elaboration, it is an excellent example of 做门楣, as no son-in-law can be better than an emperor to bring his family-in-law honors and social status. In addition, such a translation rings a bell to the ears of those who are familiar with Bai Juyi's famous long poem, A Song of Immortal Regret, 长恨歌 conclusion. The study starts with an exploration of some theoretical discussions on performability in drama translation and ends with identifying Sikh translation and foreignization as feasible approaches to translate Chinese drama classics into English. On the one hand, the historical review, probing of generic conventions and observation of current practices in intercultural staging in the study indicate that the performability-oriented translation may not fit in the case of Chinese English translation of classical Chinese drama. On the other hand, some translators and scholars in the field have adopted the Sikh translation and foreignization approaches and proved them to be practical and effective. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Professor Wang, I noticed you didn't mention the 联相伴 at all.
Yeah.
Although in your paper, it was actually the focus of analysis.
So Steve is here. And
I know you translated it with Steve.
He and I just finished translating this play.
How different is the translation of 联相伴 from Birch's translation of the 西厢记?
Birch's translation is 牡丹亭, the peony.
牡丹亭, 牡丹亭.
Yeah.
How different is your translation of 联相伴?
联相伴. Maybe Steve could join me on this. Well, I think I learned quite a bit from, both West and Edelman's translation, and also Bird's translation in terms of handling some really difficult, untranslatable elements. Poetry is already very difficult to translate. I think in play you do deal with both prose and sort of like a poetry in a way. However, allusions are so many in place, isn't it, Steve? You want to say something? So I think that we kind of used similar approaches to provide some paratexts and to provide some annotations, and also like in terms of the inner textual space, we try to so that this, I agree with Professor Wu on his point of, like sometimes you cannot, for every allusion, every metaphor, you provide, a note. So sometimes you have to have some strategies to cut down some, I guess, notes or annotations. Steve, you want to say something?
Sure. Well, I didn't really look at the all of the implications as you did, Ying, in terms of translation theory, but I think we tried to strike the balance that some of you have been talking about between, the literary and the sinological, and really trying to create a version that would be aimed at an audience, beyond the academy, but still to satisfy more academic readers as well. So I don't know how it all stacks up, but I think we've done a pretty good job.
So in the paper, I actually gave one example, an aria by Fan Shi. So there are totally 6 sentences, and 5 of them are questions, are kind of like, questions to himself, kind of like contemplating what is going on, because his bride went to the temple and kind of like stayed for a very long time. So he's kind of like expecting her coming back and contemplating what actually made her stay. And so all of the 5 questions include allusions. So then, so I mentioned only one is necessary. Only one is absolutely necessary. For those that are not necessary, Steve, so we avoided providing notes. We provided, I believe, 269 notes already. Even we tried so hard, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
other questions? Well, as I said this morning, if you have other comments or questions, you can write to the presenter using the emails that we have provided. So I think we'll call it a day. People here in Hong Kong started at 8 o'clock in the morning, and this is midnight. So we are justifiably tired. Well, once again, the reminder is that you should send us your revised paper by 15th of May.
May I have a suggestion?
Yes.
And could we be a little bit flexible about that deadline? Extend a little bit in the meantime. Ask each of the participants pick up one paper that interests him or her, and that will have a kind of mini dialogue. So you have at least your paper have someone, look at it and provide you a more detailed comment in addition to what we get in the discussion.
Yeah, that looks fine. Yeah, that looks fine.
Or you can think about the pairing of our presentation. Based on our discussion, you see the connection then and the dialogue, and then offer some suggestion, or or in the meantime, the participant can also propose to say, I want to read a comment on so and so's paper, and I would like to have so and so to comment on my paper. So that probably will really help you to see the blind spot you would otherwise not see, and the benefit from the criticism. It's better to be criticized by your friends than to have the things come out in stone, and then
Yes.
I think probably I don't know. Probably
Would it be good? Would it be good for the peer reviewer to stay anonymous? So I'll give each one of the presenters an anonymous
But
person.
I think probably among friends, among participants, probably may not be necessary. We have a real anonymous, so we can be constructive, critical in the meantime, constructive. That I think, well, that would make things simple. Whatever way you want to pursue it.
Yeah. What do our participants think?
Yeah.
Any ideas on this? I certainly think that this will help improve your papers. I mean, if you have input from at least another person. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Watch
Number
our
one,
backs, we watch each other's back. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, are we going to be very strict in terms of the length of the paper? Because we were told it will be 12,000.
10,000 words.
10,000?
10,000? Did we say 10,000?
10,000, 12,000 would be fine.
12,000. So I'm way over. So just too long, and maybe cut down. And so the second question is Patricia Sieber will be. Is she part of it? Because like I feel like so lonely here.
She has agreed to turn in the paper by mid-May.
Yeah, I gave her the deadline of May 15th because she didn't come
otherwise you
to this meeting.
She will be part of it. She will be part of it. Right?
Well, yeah. So you want to pair up with her?
No, I mean I can try to reach her and to.
Yeah, and ask her if she's willing. I mean, yeah.
But I can assume she's busy.
I think probably I would suggest that each one of us will propose someone you want to have to read your paper, and then in the meantime, Leo, you can do some coordinating work. And would that be okay?
Yeah. So perhaps you could write to me once you have found a partner. Write to me via email. And just let me know. So I don't want to dictate, and kind of.
I mean you're coordinating, and then you stay in the loop. You stay in the loop. I think that probably.
Yeah, I'll stay in the loop, but yeah.
I also for the next symposium, I would suggest, we at least have someone to comment on the paper, so that person is obligated to read at least one paper in detail. So that
I read them all. Anyway, I read them all. But yeah, that would be a good idea. Yeah, and the presentations do not have to be that long, since we all have the papers, so we can cut short the presentation time and then give like 5 minutes to the discussion. Yeah, and then others would comment and raise questions. Yes, but that's for the you're talking about the philosophy. Symposium.
Yeah.
You're not talking about
symposium. Yeah. I'll talk with you. Later on. Okay. We don't want to keep everybody here. Any suggestions? Post a symposium, the kind of work we should do, and the kind of thing you would think is helpful, and the fellow panelists, fellow participants. Any suggestions? Would that be okay? Okay. Then, for example,
I'll just look forward to I'll look forward to hearing from you about your choice of a partner. Okay.
No, no,
I
yeah,
can-
yeah.
Well, I can talk to
Everyone.
Steve. Steve, I can talk to him.
Yeah,
So,
that's fine.
so are you in Japan? Are you in US?
Steve is in San Francisco.
Yeah, he originally decided to go to Japan, maybe not being able to.
I'm not aware
Steve,
of it.
I will send you the paper. I will
Oh,
send you
sorry.
the
Yeah,
paper.
I'm sorry. Yes, I am in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I am planning to go to Japan eventually, but as you know, the country's closed right now.
It's still closed.
It's
So I
closed.
will send you the paper. I will send you the paper, and we can,
Sure.
if you are not so
Sure,
busy,
that'd
you
be
can
great.
talk. Yeah.
Sure.
So any other ideas, or would Zhongqi like to add anything?
No, I think that we have said enough, and I just want to call it a day. And yeah, it's at midnight now. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just say that we can extend this deadline a little bit. End
Yeah,
of June. End
1
of
or 2
June.
weeks,
Sorry,
yeah.
end of May.
End of May, yeah.
End
but-
of May. You know, yeah. So you have like almost 2 months, hopefully. Maybe. Yeah, end of May. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all for coming to.
I just want to thank Zhongqi and Leo again. This is a lot of work. Really appreciate. Okay.
Well, thanks for
Thank
saying
you.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
We
everybody.
love to have you,
Thank
and
you.
I enjoyed reading the papers. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well,
It's not nice to meet everyone here, and hopefully we'll meet in person sometime later. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, take care. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. I look forward to hearing from you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.